apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to cover over the next couple of hours. Just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend, Representative Matt Shaheen, and get a little bit of an update on some things that were accomplished in the last legislative session, looking ahead, and also talking about the 2020 elections and all sorts of issues related to those topics. So we'll get to that in just a minute. A little bit later, Rick Scarborough will be with us by phone, and in between, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we've learned about the attempted impeachment of the President of the United States and what that might mean and what the case for it might be, how that timeline might work out, and a variety of other issues. And then later, the next hour, we'll be talking also with Abraham Hamilton. Many of you may hear him on American Family Radio. He has his own program there, the Hamilton Corner, and also has been an individual that has served in the government. Want to get some of his perspective, if I can, on, how is it that we create these transcripts in the Situation Room, and what happens to them, and what is the legal basis for impeachment, or whether or not this is even something that is going far beyond what the framers intended. And then in the next hour, we'll also be talking with Hannah Anderson. That is a book about rediscovering the lost art of discernment, something we talk about so often here on Point of View. The book's All That's Good. So we have a lot to cover, and along the way, we'll also cover some of the issues in the news. But let me welcome to the microphone once again Matt Shaheen. He first joined us around the round table before he actually was elected, and now, of course, has served in the District 66 Texas House of Representatives, an individual that has been very much involved in the political process for some time, serves on the House Committee on Ways and Means, vice chair of the House Urban Affairs Committee, and also before that served on the Collin County Commissioner's Court. And Matt Shaheen, always great to have you on the program.
Hey, Kerby, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be back.
The other day we had Kathy Ward on. We were talking about the importance of the election, and I thought I might talk to somebody who had a relatively close election. Is that a fair statement? And it gets us to one of the things that I still hear from time to time, Matt, and that is, what's the difference of one vote? I think if anybody can address the issue of the importance of one vote, you had a pretty close election last time, did you not?
Yeah, I really did. It's interesting. 2 years ago, when of course, House members in the Texas House run every 2 years, and so in 2016 we had won by 19 percentage points. Last year, the 2018 November election, we won by 0.5%. So it was close. It was 390 votes that we won by, so definitely a smaller margin. And then, of course, Kerby, you might remember when I very first ran for office, almost 10 years ago now, I had won by 30 votes. So, yes, every single vote counts without a doubt.
I had forgotten about the 30-vote one, so there we go. I'm going to just keep using you as an example. Now, I have a few that I've collected over the years of people that have actually had a tie vote. There was one that happened in Ohio. There was one that happened in Chicago area, and so those are the closest you can get. But 30 votes or 300 votes just, again, illustrate a very key point, which is something else I want to get to that I talked about the other day with Kathy Ward, and that is we have all sorts of people moving into, for example, House District 66. It would seem to me that you'd want to encourage every one of your precinct chairmen out there to go out and find those new people coming in and to register them to vote. I have, as I was just thinking about this, have a neighbor across the street that just moved in, and it just occurred to me, I'm sure they are not in the same precinct anymore, so they probably need to change their registration. And those are the kinds of things that need to happen now, because a lot of people say, look, it's 2019. The election isn't until November 2020. Yeah, well, that's why now is a very good time to start thinking about registering people to vote, and even encouraging them to not take for granted their vote and recognize that that one vote might make a difference.
Oh, yeah, Kirby. I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, the message for conservatives is we need to start. We need to start now. Just so you know, personally, me and my campaign, we started actually in April. So we're underway. We have a concerted voter registration effort underway that's specific to my House district. But then there's one statewide. We're actually targeting over 1 million individuals, and there's multiple different ways that we've identified these individuals, either their previous voting records from the states that they came forth, or there's micro-targeting, and there's over 1 million individuals who are identified as conservative that the Republican Party is going to be reaching out to. So, starting now is not too early. As you alluded to, the races last November, were very tight, not only mine, but a handful of others. We actually lost some Republican seats. And then, of course, I think nationwide people understand how close Senator Ted Cruz's election was against Beto O'Rourke.
So let's, if we can, maybe also tell people that they need to start paying attention to a couple of things. And one of those is one of your colleagues, Jeff Leach, pushed through an opportunity for people to actually vote on this issue of whether or not to have a Texas income tax. And I think they have to recognize that you have to vote yes to say no. So explain that for just a minute, because we'll certainly try to educate people as we go along. But that's one of those very important votes, and something that I think is pretty significant out of the last legislative session.
Yeah, Jeff Leach had a great session. He provided great leadership on this topic and a bunch of other things, some pro-life matters as well. It's a pleasure and honor to work with Jeff. He's just a great member in the Texas House. And one of his legislative accomplishments was he passed legislation, passed both houses, and the governor signed it. And yes, it gives the citizens of Texas the opportunity to vote on totally getting rid of the idea of actually incorporating it into the Texas Constitution that an income tax is not allowed in the state. A lot of people believe that that's already in the Constitution because we don't have a state income tax. We tend to brag about that, and we should. It's one of the reasons why so many companies are moving to the state of Texas, so many individuals. Our economy is so robust, 3.4% unemployment rate. Our GDP is, just through the roof. Texas is actually the 10th largest economy in the world, so we're quite the presence in the worldwide economy. And so this piece of legislation, when people go to vote in November, they'll actually have the opportunity, and you articulated it correctly, they need to vote yes on a constitutional amendment that essentially bans the whole concept of a income tax in the state of Texas. So it was a great legislative achievement for Jeff Leach, and I want to encourage everybody to get out there and vote for that.
Let's take a break. When we come back, a couple other things I want to talk about. Of course, in the past legislative session, you mentioned the pro-life issue. You, of course, serve on the board of Prestonwood Pregnancy Center. And, of course, we've talked about that on numerous occasions here on the program. So I wanted to talk about some of the pro-life issues, and then also a couple of issues that you are kind of looking at right now to pay attention to in the future. So Matt Shaheen with us, representing the 66th District in the Texas House of Representatives. And if you say, well, I don't know where that district is, we have a link to his website. It has a very nice map, so it'll show you whether you're in that district or not. Even if you're not, as you probably have figured out right now, he would certainly welcome your support as an individual that won by 300 votes last time. He'd like to win by a few more next time. So if you say, I like what he's doing and I don't happen to be in his district, I'm sure he'd be glad to have you come and help him out in his district. We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, one of the largest youth-led demonstrations took place around the globe. Those young people in New York then convened a Youth Climate Summit on the weekend preceding the Climate Week that followed at the United Nations. If you were paying attention, you likely heard what sounded like two different messages, but actually each one was tailored for the appropriate audience. We used to hear that we only have a few years or a decade before doom and gloom. Now we're hearing many environmentalists talking about what will happen in 50 years or 100 years. The problem with doom and gloom predictions is they can be tested. A few months ago, I wrote a commentary that listed many of the failed predictions by Paul Ehrlich, George Wald, and others. The problem with making a prediction that millions will starve to death by 1980 is you discover that millions didn't starve to death. The Competitive Enterprise Institute recently posted dozens and dozens of failed environmental predictions that never occurred. That's why you're hearing leaders now talking about what will happen 50 to 100 years from now. You can't disprove that. Why are we simultaneously hearing young people in the streets and even in Congress claiming that we only have 10 to 12 years left? That is simple. They don't have any history of failed environmental predictions, and it's worth adding that they don't really know much about history. They are less likely to be skeptical as the adults. Some of us remember when we were told that the greatest threat was global cooling because we were putting particulates in the atmosphere. Then we heard that the threat was global warming because we were putting CO2 in the atmosphere. The current threat has morphed into climate change, or now climate crisis. The policy recommendations for each are the same, even though the strategy and the timeline have changed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have Matt Shaheen with us, again representing the 66th District of the Texas House of Representatives. And Matt Shaheen serves not only as a deacon at Prestonwood Baptist Church, but also on the board of the church's Pregnancy Center, the Pregnancy Center for Prestonwood. And a while back, Matt, we had Leanne Jameson, who is the executive director of the Prestonwood Pregnancy Center, and then Jamie Stanley, which we announced as a Southwest version of that as well. And so I know that you've had a real heart for these pregnancy centers, and I think it would be worth mentioning some of the very significant pieces of legislation that actually were passed out of the Texas legislature on issues of life, whether it was the issue of saying that we cannot ignore a child that survived a botched abortion, whether it is the way in which we have in many ways funded some of these pro-abortion groups with decreased rent and things of that nature. So talk about that whole issue of life, because I know that has been always key to some of the things you've been talking about there in the 66th District.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, Kerby. You know, one of the things that we really wanted to do is as a state was to send a message about life. We do that every session, but there were such extreme comments that were made, if you recall, by the governor from the state of Virginia, and I think others, with respect to the situation where a baby could survive an abortion procedure, and then the decision would be just to lay that little baby, on a cold metal table and make a decision on whether that little baby should live or not. It's just the extent of where the pro-choice movement has gone is just incredible. And so, what we wanted to do as a state, as leaders in the pro-life movement, is really send a message. And so a couple of things that we did. We not only passed the Born Alive bill, which protects that little baby and instructs the doctor that they must give care to that little baby. That little baby is a child. It's a gift of God. It needs to be treated as such. And it's just it's incredible, Kerby. And I mean, we even have to have this kind of discussion, but it's where things have progressed. And
Yes.
so we wanted to send a strong message. We love little babies in the state of Texas, and the nation and the world needs to know that. And we're going to do everything we can to protect those little babies. And so not only did we send a message, but this was real. And we had several women come to the committee and testify they had survived
Yes.
an abortion. I actually met one of the ladies. Just incredible story. So this is real life stuff. We're going to continue to fight. I'll tell you though, on just the whole pro-life fight. I think the church, the Christian community has really done such a superb job. We have more work to do, obviously, but the number of abortions are declining. But just the way the Christian community has come in and just surrounded a lot of these girls that are young and they're scared. We've just comforted them with love and support and guided them to a very difficult process. But just saving so many babies just through sharing Christ and letting that mom hear the heartbeat, see the sonograms, it just made a world of difference. So we're going to continue to do that, continue to grow our efforts. And then you alluded to the fact that we also passed a piece of legislation to ensure that no state tax dollars will go to funding abortions in the state of Texas. Now we've got some battles going on where we have one or two municipalities that are trying to bypass that by using their city budget. So we'll probably have to continue to fight this approach, but we'll definitely do that. And we got to make sure that there's no tax dollars in the state of Texas that goes towards supporting any kind of abortion efforts.
Well, I know that one of the things you want to talk about, because you just posted this on Twitter, is something related, and that is the issue of health care. And you say because of Obamacare and other big government programs, family health insurance now tops, this is sticker shock, $20,000 per year. And I know you're trying to work to reverse that. Tell us more.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of effort with respect to healthcare reform that we're doing in the state of Texas. What's interesting is that the healthcare industry is moving towards a different model, and it's gradually gaining steam within the healthcare industry. And what it is it's actually removing the insurance company from the process. So now what's happening is you have so much interference between the patient and the doctor, whether it's the insurance company telling you what you need to do, those types of things, let alone the government and the doctors. We're actually starting to face a shortage of doctors. There's so many individuals that, being a doctor is not as attractive because you graduate with all this debt and you've got to deal with all this accounting and government interference and all that kind of stuff. In fact, the last month when I went to go see my doctor, the first thing he did was whip out a laptop, open it up to a website that was a governmental website telling me what was covered, what wasn't. I mean, it's totally, that doctor-patient relationship has totally been distorted. So what the industry is doing now is they're going towards what's called direct primary care or a concierge service, where the doctor will just directly with the patient, so not even work with an insurance company, will just charge a monthly fee, $50, $75, $100, and that patient has unlimited access to that doctor. And so from a state perspective, what I'd like to do and what we're taking a look at is how do we take that approach and use that to provide health care to the needy, right? That's the issue that we all try to struggle with. How do we expand access to health care? And this could be a model that we could use so that instead of the state working through insurance companies, managed care companies, we can just go to doctors throughout the state of Texas and really leverage what they call the direct primary care model. So the state can just pay X amount of dollars per month, and the doctor agrees to see X amount of needy patient. If you do that, it'll drastically drive down the cost of health care. It'll expand access to health care. It'll save the state of Texas literally hundreds of millions of dollars, because we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the technology to drive these drive the transactions, the health care claims, and we've got to employ people to do those transactions. This would be a much simpler model.
Well, and again, I think it's a good illustration of taking a very significant issue that oftentimes is identified as the Democratic Party's issue, and say, wait a minute, we have some solutions, and they don't require Medicare for all. They don't require even Obamacare Part 2. As a matter of fact, some of the reasons we have that is because we've got the government too much involved. So I think it's just a great illustration of that. And again, we have a link to your Twitter posts as well as your Facebook page and to your website, which is mattshaheen.com. If you don't know how to spell Shaheen, it's 2 E's, but we have that on our website, pointofview.net. But in the few minutes remaining, talk about what you see in the future. Obviously, one of those issues is this idea of Obamacare and some of these government programs. Anything else that we need to know about on some of the issues you've been talking about lately as you've been traveling around?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's significant issues that we're working through right now. I mean, we've got just the border and the impact that that's having on the state of Texas. What I think a lot of people may not realize is the Texas border with Mexico. That's the number one entry into the United States for human trafficking. And the average victim of sex trafficking in the United States is some little girl between the ages of 12 to 14. So
Wow.
The federal government, has not stepped up to do what it needs to do. There's a big debate. Washington, D.C. is just, it's broken. They can't even pass resolutions, let alone secure our border. So the state of Texas is actually stepping in to the tune of $800 million to address the border and do what we can as a state. But it's a huge issue. The entryway into drugs, human trafficking, it's a big issue. So we did some good things around human trafficking this last legislative session, but there's more that we need to do. Texas, we are the number 2 most calls in the national human trafficking hotline in the United States. So we got more work to do, but human trafficking is going to get a lot of attention over the next couple of years.
And I think it just illustrates, again, some of the topics that are front and center. So, again, if people wanted to know more about Matt Shaheen, you can go to mattshaheen.com. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, even if somebody doesn't live in the 66th district, you probably would welcome anybody coming in and walking precincts with you or helping you out, wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're a really grassroots campaign. We love reaching out to folks. And I'll tell you what's really neat, Kerby, is that the diversity of my district, right? I mean, we have a bunch of people, again, because of the economic success that we're experiencing here in Texas, right? We have people not only from different parts of the United States, but different parts of the world. We have a lot of people coming from the country of India. Of course, you had the Prime Minister of India down in Houston last weekend. He welcomed the President of the United States. That was such a great event. We have a lot of people coming from China, really all over the world, and there's so much that the conservative movement has to offer them that we align with, and we're reaching out to everybody to have an impact and grow the conservative movement, the Republican Party, and we're doing it right here in HD 66. So any kind of grassroots effort that's our big focus.
Well, we certainly appreciate you joining with us. Look forward to the next opportunity. And again, if you'd like to know more about Matt Shaheen, it's mattshaheen.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I thought for just a few minutes I might make a few comments about what's going on in the impeachment exercise. I will probably have more to say about that in the next, well, probably the third hour. But again, many of you do not listen or are not able to listen to it, but you, of course, listen to it online. But your local radio station may not carry that third hour, so I understand that. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of a preview of something I will go into perhaps in a little more detail later on. And don't forget that about a half an hour from now, we're going to have Rick Scarborough with us, and then Abraham Hamilton. So really great material that we're going to cover here today. But Derek Hunter raises a question that I've now heard a number of other people raising as well. And his question is simply this: if the case for Trump's impeachment is so strong, why are liberals lying about it? In other words, if indeed this is a slam dunk and all you have to do is get a vote, because so far, if indeed the New York Times estimate is correct, and there's no reason to doubt it since I saw similar kinds of head counts in Politico and other places, you have 220 Democrats that are saying they're ready to vote for impeachment. Well, you only need 218, right? So, 220, excuse me. Got the number backwards, 218. Yeah, that's right. I guess I said it right. And so you've already got what you need. You don't need any more. You don't need any Republican to come out and vote for impeachment. You don't even need, I think they had about 15 that were uncommitted Democrats. You don't even need all of them. You pretty much have what you need right now. So if indeed that is the case, you need 218 out of 435, you got what you need. You got 220, so you've even got a margin for error. And let's face it, a few of the doubtful Democrats, if the vote were coming today, they would get the message that if they didn't vote for it, they wouldn't receive any funds for their reelection campaign. So the fix is in, if you think about it. So you don't need to convince Democrats. You really don't necessarily need to convince the already convinced out there. I think about 35% of people in the latest survey say they believe that an impeachment is likely and necessary. So why go to the extreme of saying things that are honestly not true? And so Derek Hunter says, when we were kids, we learned something very simple. Honesty is the best policy. Telling the truth is easy because then you just keep telling the truth. But when you lie, then you have to remember, who did I lie to? What did I say? And when they catch you in maybe a discrepancy, what do I have to lie to keep the thing going? And so the bottom line is that up until we had the transcript, I know sometimes people don't call it a transcript or the memo, but everybody's starting to call it the transcript. And I know it's not a word-for-word transcript, but nevertheless, that transcript, we could see that the so-called quid pro quo is not there. As a matter of fact, if anything, it just illustrated the media malpractice that we talked about with Gary Bauer on Friday. But you may not have heard that. He just reminded us that when the President Donald Trump, talked about a favor, he's talking about CrowdStrike. And yet, then if you look at the media coverage, there are ellipses, 3 dots. You've seen those before, which eliminate 560 words that then take to a conversation they're having about the whole issue of what was being concerned about the Biden issue. And so the point is that I think if you actually read the transcript, and apparently a lot of the people in the mainstream media did not read the transcript, they just simply took what somebody said about it. You really can't even come close to anything like that. And then Derek Hunter goes on to say that it didn't stop Democrats from saying it did. It did not stop anchors at CNN and MSNBC from saying so. And he gives us a couple of examples on MSNBC. They say the transcript said, will you do me a favor and investigate Vice President Biden's son? Will you do me a favor and get involved in the 2020 election? Of course, none of that's in the transcript. None of what actually Adam Schiff said was in the transcript to be true. And then in CNN, do me a favor, the president asked Zelensky to dig up dirt. Dirt, that word came from Adam Schiff. So anyway, the point that he is making is that there are all sorts of people that are repeating the false narrative. Of course, we've seen this before, haven't we? Hands up, don't shoot. The president actually talked about those good people and meant the white supremacists. None of that's true, but if you repeat it enough, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute, people begin to believe it. And so the point he's making here is just read the transcript yourself and you will come to a very different conclusion. But then he reminds us that if there is a Ukrainian issue, it goes all the way back to what was really the first part of the conversation, and that is Politico, which is kind of a left-leaning organ. Back in January of 2017, just after Donald Trump was elected, had a headline, Ukrainian efforts to sabotage Trump backfire. So if there's anything out of Ukraine, it wasn't that there was a quid pro quo between Donald Trump and Zelensky, but actually a quid pro quo or an attempt to use Ukrainian material to actually defeat Donald Trump as a candidate and then to begin to undermine his presidency when he was elected. And so, again, you can read the quote itself, but it says Ukrainian government officials tried to help Hillary Clinton and undermine Trump by publicly questioning his fitness for office. They also disseminated documents implicating a top Trump aide in corruption and suggested that they were investigating the matter only to back away after the election. And they helped, here's the key part, helped Clinton's allies research damaging information on Trump and his advisors. And that was an investigation done by Politico. So if there is a smoking gun out of Ukraine, it goes all the way back to some of the connections between those in Ukraine and Hillary Clinton's campaign. But nevertheless, we'll leave that alone. Because over the weekend, we also learned a few other things. And first of all, the whistleblower, who apparently is now going to testify, as Derek Hunter points out, gets all the information wrong. Whoever this person is admits that he or she had no firsthand knowledge of any of it. They played the child's game called telephone, where a couple of people who allegedly had knowledge felt compelled to file a complaint. And that's concerning, first of all. So that brings us back to something else we've now learned, because some of the people that have criticized the so-called whistleblower said, wait a minute, a whistleblower is supposed to have firsthand knowledge. Charles Grassley, for example, has been a real supporter of that. Now he's been very critical of the whistleblower. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, doesn't a whistleblower have to have first-hand knowledge? Up until a month ago, that's the case. But the law was changed so that a whistleblower did not have to have first-hand knowledge. And this is when you start wondering, maybe there is something to this story that this was all orchestrated by the deep state, because isn't it just very convenient that, first of all, the whistleblower didn't have to have first-hand knowledge? And then the question that a number of people have been bringing up is that I mentioned Congressman Adam Schiff. He knew weeks before about the whistleblower complaint. He knew the exact narrative of the complaint. He actually, at one point, even said Trump is withholding vital military Ukraine while his personal lawyer seeks help from the Ukrainian government to investigate his opponent, which, by the way, is wrong. But nevertheless, that's what Adam Schiff said. And so he tweeted this kind of a month ago, which means he knew about the complaint before it even was surfaced. And apparently, when all of the other Democrats got on board instantaneously, and all the mainstream press got on instantaneously, if you're looking for a conspiracy, and I'm not much for these conspiracies, but if you're looking for what could be sometimes called collusion, it seems like everybody knew about this even before it ended up in the headlines. And so these are some issues that have just kind of surfaced over the weekend that I thought might be of interest to our listeners, and that's why I want to bring it to you. And when we come back from the break, this other piece by Elizabeth Vaughn talks about gaslighting. Now, I've never liked the phrase gaslighting, but it comes from the movie, so we're just stuck with it. And gaslighting is where someone insists so strenuously on a false version of events or facts. After a while, you begin to no longer trust your own perception of it. And, of course, we've seen this in personal relationships. You know, I've even referred to that as crazy making. There was a book came out years ago called Crazy Making. You've seen sometimes in families where the person that's crazy, after a while, convince everybody else that they're crazy, that they're really the sane one, everybody else is crazy. Well, gaslighting is sort of like that, only it applies not only to personal relationships, it also applies to politics, and we've seen this time and time again. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about how there are some facts that I think everybody that's looking at this with any kind of objectivity would have to agree with, but they're all given this really kind of bizarre interpretation. And so, once again, it underscores something we'll be talking about in the 2 o'clock hour, the need for discernment. Let's take a break. We'll talk more about gaslighting and impeachment right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes, and then we'll be talking with Rick Scarborough, and a little bit later, Adam Hamilton. So just some really good interviews coming up here. But since I got a few more minutes, let me come back to this idea of gaslighting. I don't like the phrase. I wish somebody could come up with it. Any of you out there in the listening audience that are wordsmiths, come up with something else, because it doesn't communicate at all. Every time I hear somebody talking about gaslighting, I have to look it up again, remind ourselves of what it is. But again, it's the idea that somebody will repeat something falsely enough times that after a while you begin to think, well, your version, you may be right and I must be wrong. And there are some very good examples of that, but one of those actually unfolding right before our very eyes. Elizabeth Bond says that what right now many of the Democrats, led in part by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, do is they skate over the very real evidence that at the very least Hunter Biden's job and appointment to the board of the energy company in Ukraine while his father was vice president actually took place because of the fact that he has that kind of position. And that Joe Biden, as vice president, threatened to withhold $1 billion in aid to a country unless they fired their prosecutor general. So Elizabeth Vaughn brings 2 points. Okay, fact number one, Hunter's dealings certainly represented a conflict of interest, if nothing else, because the Obama administration would want to look like it wasn't in some situation in a relationship with Ukraine for the benefit of the vice president's son. So that's fact number one. I think anybody could accept that at least as a fact on the table. Fact number two is, again, this is not open to question. Joe Biden, as vice president, leveraged U.S. aid to force the firing of a Ukraine official. That's not open for debate because he said it. He actually verbalized that at a Council on Foreign Relations meeting. So these are the two facts. Now, she comes back, and this is what I appreciate, because sometimes people just engage in hyperbole. She says, okay, let's take each fact and think of the least objectionable, if you will, what she calls the least bad scenario. Number one, at the very least, Hunter Biden's dealings with Ukraine at the very least showed poor judgment, even if it wasn't a violation of the law. So that's the first thing to really think about in that regard. And so that's the first thing to be kind of put on the table. Then the second one is that Biden leveraged U.S. aid to force a firing of a Ukrainian official. If you're looking for a quid pro quo, that looks like one. And so, again, she says that may have been a violation of the law. She says, I'm not a lawyer, so I really don't know. But nevertheless, what you have right now are attempts to impeach a sitting president of the United States based upon a second or third hand claim from what has already been acknowledged as a highly partisan whistleblower. And so I thought was interesting that, I don't know if she's a Christian or not, but she was struck by the fact that it reminded her of Matthew 7, where we talk about looking in the speck in the brother's eye, but failing to notice the beam in your own. This has been something that has been really interesting so far, that the justification for this July 25th phone call and whistleblower complaint, at least in part, had to do with the actions of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. And yet, who has even more recently interviewed Hunter Biden or even Joe Biden? So anyway, it's kind of an interesting look at what some people are right now referring to gaslighting. But before we take a break, I thought I'd point out something that I've never seen before. Maybe it's come out and I just haven't seen it. This on letterhead from Biden for President is calling for the media to no longer interview Rudy Giuliani. No longer can Rudy Giuliani be actually interviewed because they just want to keep him off the air because they say that he's made misleading comments about the Biden family and Ukraine. And I'll leave it to you to figure out how misleading they are in light of what we just talked about. But a very good piece that just came out the other day that was looking at this came up with one of two solutions. Either one of the reasons why Biden's campaign wanted to do this is that they're playing multi-dimensional chess, as he says. They want to draw as much attention to Rudy Giuliani as possible because Giuliani might be hurting Trump, or they might be hurting Biden or somebody like that, and so they just want to take all the pressure off of him. The other is more likely, and that is the Democrats right now recognize that even as they move forward on impeachment, they recognize that they may actually keep their loyal voters in the primary, but there is, as it says here, zero evidence that impeaching Trump is a political winner, and they have a lot to indicate that it would be a loser. And there seems to be this assumption, and I think it's an accurate assumption, that indeed the party that pushes for the impeachment of a president, last time it was a Republican Party pushing for the impeachment of Bill Clinton, usually loses dramatically in the next election because people, after a while, just simply want to know, why in the world did you spend all your time, energy, and resources in that regard? And so the article goes on to remind us that Hunter Biden is an individual that would be interesting to profile, but Right now, let me mention a few things you probably don't know about him. First of all, he was thrown out of the Navy Reserve for cocaine use. Matter of fact, his ex-wife actually complained that their family budget was always messed up because he was blowing it on drugs and hookers and things of that nature. And then out of the blue lands a gig that pays him more than $50,000 a month. Some people say as high as $65,000 a month when he has no energy experience. And then his father decides that he will pull the plug on $1 billion in aid if they don't stop the investigation. Now, again, the argument from Biden, to be fair, says, well, there was corruption there, and there certainly was, and so that may be justification enough. But like we said, the optics don't look very well on any of that as well. In the midst of this, there has been an interesting criticism of the president over his tweets. Well, that's kind of daily, but this one I thought was kind of interesting because it suggests that maybe we need to stop using certain words. I've suggested that stop comparing somebody to Hitler, stop comparing what is happening to the Holocaust. You may have even heard of Godwin's law that just says, as a discussion goes on in Twitter, sooner or later somebody's going to invoke Hitler. Well, another set of words we might think about not using all the time is civil war, and it has to do with the fact that Donald Trump the other day actually retweeted a piece that came actually from Pastor Robert Jeffress, in which he said that if Democrats are successful in removing the president from office, which they may never be, it will cause a civil war-like fracture in this nation from which our country will never heal. And this representative from the state of Illinois said, I've visited nations ravaged by civil war. I've never imagined such a quote to be repeated by a president. This is beyond repugnant. And, there may be a point in this. I'm thinking about doing a commentary and saying, I hate to say that maybe words like civil war should be off the table like Hitler and Holocaust, but if you really understand even the nature of the American Civil War, let's hope we never have anything like that again. Brother killing brother, 600,000 deaths and all the rest. And so there are a lot of people that criticize the president's tweet, but that one kind of struck me as maybe it had some merit. And so we'll think about that and consider that maybe in the future. Let's take a break, though. Rick Scarborough has a lot to say, especially for pastors, on how they can educate their congregation about politics and the impeachment and the upcoming elections. All that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is, of course, the beginning of a new week and, of course, all sorts of new revelations about the issue of impeachment. We'll get into that a little bit later, but also we'll be gearing up for election 2020. And so I want to bring to the microphone here a number of guests that I think will help educate you on some of those issues. And that will be certainly Rick Scarborough in just a minute as we talk about Recover America Now. And you may remember him as the founder of Vision America. We'll be talking about what's going on there. Abraham Hamilton will be with us in about a half an hour. And he, of course, is the general counsel for American Family Association, also hosts the Hamilton Corner. We'll be talking about what's happening in the bureaucracy, the deep state, impeachment, variety of different issues. And in the next hour, Hannah Anderson will be with us as we talk about this issue of discernment, a book, All That's Good, Recovering the Lost Art of Discernment. We'll talk about that for a little while, and then we'll get back into some other pieces on the impeachment issue and some of the other political issues that we'll finish off. So a lot to cover in the next 2 hours. But let me bring to the microphone Rick Scarborough. You might remember back in 1998 when he founded Vision America, a pastor who said, you know, we need to get more involved in the political process, did a great deal for a while in pastor mobilization, and then used a lot of data-driven kind of material to influence the election. Back in March of this year, resigned from Vision America, and I want him to tell us a little bit more about this new organization. So, Rick Scarborough, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, it's so good to be with you, Kerby. When I launched Vision America, Marlon Maddox was one of the instruments that got it out there on the national scene. So this is like hometown for me.
It sure is.
Glad to be with you.
Well, let's talk about that because, first of all, Vision America is still something I think had a great deal of run because it helped pastors like you, who were a pastor originally, to see, you know, if I just keep staying in the pulpit here and I don't get involved in the political process, I'm going to see my country go down the drain. So you were instrumental in the past in really mobilizing those individuals who sometimes said, I just want to stay off of these political issues. We'll leave that to somebody else. You helped mobilize them to see what was really at stake for the future of our country.
Well, that's exactly right, Kerby. And to clarify for your listening audience, Vision America continues to go forward, and in some ways in a much more powerful way. The gentleman that took over Vision America at my request, John Graves, I call him young. I think he's 50 years old, and for us guys who've been in this movement as long as I have, that's young. But he brought fresh insight, fresh vision, and is really now developing methods and operations that make the mobilization of pastors and Christians more focused. When I stepped aside from my role as the founder and spokesperson, it was to create another organization that would link arms with Vision America that expressly focused on pastors. And as you know, that's where my vision has been since day one. And so I talked to John as recently as just in the last hour as we're making a strategy, and I'd be happy to talk about that if we have time. But we're fixing to unveil a strategy called 50 Weeks to Save America by Saving Texas. As you know, the left was empowered in the 2018 election cycle when Ted Cruz almost lost his seat, won it by 1.6 percentage points. They now believe that Texas is in play. But if God gives me blessings on what we are attempting and strategizing to do it, we're going to move that line back to 10 to 12 to 15 points where it belongs. Texas is still, I believe, a very conservative state. It's just a matter of who gets to the polls, and we're going to see that Christians, pastor-led, will get there.
You know, one of the people that actually sits in this chair every once in a while when I'm out of town is Colonel Allen West, and he's written a book recently which is just basically making the case that as Texas goes, so goes the nation. So you recognize that there are some strategic states, and I think both sides recognize that the state of Texas and a couple of the other states around the country, especially these swing states, and I'm thinking Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and on. We can go down this very long list, are key states. So speak for just a minute, since I know that it's been a while since we've had you on. Some of our listeners might say, how did a pastor get involved in all of that? And if you can maybe give us the short version of how you began to recognize your daughter's assembly and how that kind of got you out of the pulpit into the political process. Can you share that?
I'm happy to. I'll be telling 150 pastors this story tomorrow at a luncheon here in Houston. In 1992, I was in my 18th month of pastoring First Baptist Church of Pearland. We had baptized about 500 people in that first 18 months, a real genuine move of God. And as you would expect, God moving like that, Satan is certainly going to raise his head. I got wind of a high school assembly coming to our local high school that had created quite a controversy all over Harris County. And so quickly I mobilized my associate pastor to go down and monitor that assembly. My day was completely scheduled on the day of the assembly, and I didn't see any way I could break loose. But when he came back to my office, so overwhelmed with the content, I dropped everything, and I went to the fifth of the 5 assemblies that day. And Kerby, as you've heard me say, it was so out of bounds, so over the top of anything resembling biblical morality, that I had to do something. There's not time to tell all the story, but the short of it is we mobilized our people. And within a matter of about 12 months, we had 4 of our members on the local school board out of 7. That changed the direction of that high school. We then put 3 of our people on the city council. That changed the direction of the whole community. Out of that, our people got energized when they realized, hey, we can truly make a difference. And before long, I had a sitting judge in my church. My secretary's husband was an attorney. He ran for district judge and got elected. We trained virtually our entire church in how precincts work. I brought in an expert, and before long, we controlled the precinct chair in a number of precincts. Actually had enough to influence 4 different counties because of the locale of where our church was, the number of our people that got involved. Christian Amanpour showed up with a camera crew, followed me around for about 3 months. You talk about making you pray a lot. That did. But she put out a piece called God's Warriors. It was an effort to disparage what we had stood for and what we had accomplished. And she closed her 15-minute segment on First Baptist Church Pearland with these words: Rick Scarborough's gains will be short-lived. What I will tell 150 pastors and leaders tomorrow is you be the judge. One of our members went on and served in the state legislature, Glenda Dawson. She died in office, and she now has a high school named after her in Pearland. Another member, Ed Thompson, is still serving in the state legislature with distinction. And a third member, a man whom I baptized, Randy Weber, serves on the city council, in the state legislature, and he's now in his 3rd term in Congress. The last 18 months, I've commuted back and forth to D.C., doing Bible studies in his office with other colleagues and members of Congress. He's continuing to take the legacy of what happened in that period of time in First Baptist Pearland and influencing our entire country. So what I say to pastors is everything we need to change America is sitting on the pews of our churches.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about 50 weeks to saving America. By the way, if you want to ask a question, certainly you are welcome to do so. 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk a little bit about this strategy, talk about getting various people involved, from the pastor to those in the pews. And we'll talk about that with Rick Scarborough right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, one of the largest youth-led demonstrations took place around the globe. Those young people in New York then convened a youth climate summit on the weekend preceding the climate week that followed at the United Nations. If you were paying attention, you likely heard what sounded like two different messages, but actually each one was tailored for the appropriate audience. We used to hear that we only have a few years or a decade before doom and gloom. Now we're hearing many environmentalists talking about what will happen in 50 years or 100 years. The problem with doom and gloom predictions is they can be tested. A few months ago, I wrote a commentary that listed many of the failed predictions by Paul Ehrlich, George Wald, and others. The problem with making a prediction that millions will starve to death by 1980 is you discover that millions didn't starve to death. The Competitive Enterprise Institute recently posted dozens and dozens of failed environmental predictions that never occurred. That's why you're hearing leaders now talking about what will happen 50 to 100 years from now. You can't disprove that. Why are we simultaneously hearing young people in the streets and even in Congress claiming that we only have 10 to 12 years left? That is simple. They don't have any history of failed environmental predictions, and it's worth adding that they don't really know much about history. They are less likely to be skeptical as the adults. Some of us remember when we were told that the greatest threat was global cooling because we were putting particulates in the atmosphere. Then we heard that the threat was global warming because we were putting CO2 in the atmosphere. The current threat has morphed into climate change, or now climate crisis. The policy recommendations for each are the same, even though the strategy and the timeline have changed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Rick Scarborough with us, and if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Do you think pastors and members of a church are the key to turning this country around? I'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. Rick, you were saying that, of course, the wake-up call for you in part was the teaching of this just incredibly decadent sex education, but we've on this program talked about the wake-up call for some pastors is when all of a sudden they found out that a mayor actually wanted to subpoena their sermons, or for other pastors, it's been when they found out that the city council said, no, we're not going to allow you to expand your church or have a school, or if you do, you have to have a special use permit, or we're not going to let you buy certain land. All of a sudden, pastors who used to say, I don't really want to get involved in the political process, are starting to say, you know, I better start paying attention to who is on the school board, who's on the city council, who's the mayor, who's we're going to our state legislature, and even who we're sending to Congress. And so that has been a remarkable change over the last couple of years, hasn't it?
Well, that's exactly right, Kerby. Your program does as much to enlighten the people as any program out there. You know, I think about Thomas Roast. For generations, his family owned the Harris Funeral Homes in Detroit. They had a minister working on their staff who for 6 years worked with grieving families. And then one day, he showed up in a dress, and as if nothing had changed, when he was informed he couldn't dress like a woman, he said, but I identify as a woman. They found themselves with the full weight of the civil government coming down on their heads, trying to force them to allow this man to transition right before the eyes of their clientele. They've been fighting that out in the courts ever since. This hits home. This moral chaos is an effort of Satan to bring such complete confusion and disorder to our society that society finally breaks down.
Well, again, let's, if we can, talk about your strategy, because I want to use this program, as Marlon did when you launched Vision America back in 1998, to mobilize individuals. And so, first of all, we're going to talk about where they can connect up with you, and then what's the strategy? Because you really kind of have this ongoing strategy, 50 weeks to saving America. What is that going to look like?
Well, that's right. To back up a step, the event tomorrow is to mobilize Harris County pastors, because they have an election on November 5th of this year. So we're going to challenge them to 5 weeks to move 100,000 value voters to the polls and begin to transform Harris County. But that is the seed then from which we will enlist those pastors to help us in a 50-week effort, discounting Christmas and New Year's, over the next 12 months, in which every week for 50 weeks, we're going to enlist 40 churches who will sign the dotted line, pastors who will say, I will register every eligible member of our church to vote. I will put in their hands information to inform their vote, including voter guides, which we'll recommend. And then on election day, they will move them to the polls. 40 pastors a week times 50 weeks is 2,000 churches. 2,000 churches in Texas can transform the landscape. And the reason I know that is, in 2002, we had this effort when Rick Perry was running for his first gubernatorial term of his own. We took him around the entire state, mobilized 2,000 churches, and for the first time, Texas became a very, very arch-conservative state, and has been ever since, though there's been slippage over the last few years.
Let's, if we can, talk about the fact that we are heard in a lot of different states, and many people in their particular state might say, this works pretty well. How do I go about doing that? So if people wanted to contact you, if they're in the state of Texas and do it in Texas, or if they're from another state and would like to kind of see your strategy and see if they could replicate it in their state, how can they connect with you?
Well, the best way to do that is leave information at Recover America Now. We've got the website up just barely. We actually put it online about 4 weeks ago. So there's not a lot of good information there, as there will be, but that's where we can connect with people. And then I'll give out my own personal email address, because right now we're building this movement. Rick Scarborough, RickScarborough, at cs.com, as in CompuServe. They'll write to me. I'll guarantee we'll begin to funnel them the information as we build out this site, define the campaign. When I began to receive this inspiration to start this organization, I started right where I started before, contacting people like yourself who know our history, who will help us get there. And this first event tomorrow literally is a miracle unfolding. We're adding pastors every day, right up to the last moment, but at the last count, 150. And so we're launching this, and we're going to move it across America.
Let me just mention real quickly that you've got recoveramerica.now.org. And for those of you that want to see the luncheon and all the guest speakers, and we'll talk about those in just a minute, that's all available for those of you that would like to attend, but that's a very small percentage of you. But the rest of you that would want to use this as kind of a model to use in your community, let's do so. And Rick, let's take some phone calls. Let me head up to, first of all, New Hampshire. Kat, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I would just like to add a couple of things. I just caught the tail end of the gentleman who's saying they're going to come together, and that's just what I was speaking about. I just wanted to make a comment that everybody in each state here in the United States, if you're a Christian, you should get together with other people and quietly get together with other Christians like this gentleman that was just on, and come together and share the truths of what you see going on politically in your own community. Because where I live, I have seen people who say that they're for female equal rights. They're out there pushing this in the media and saying how bad it is. Those very individuals who are attorneys and court officials, they falsify documents, perjure themselves before court, even though there's hard evidence to show what they did. And there's no way that they're so ingrained in our legal systems and in our court systems that it's going to take people coming together, just like this gentleman said, sharing what's going on in each state and coming up with unique ways to deal with this and to get these people out and out them publicly so that everyone knows what's going on and can see the truth during an election cycle and any other time of the year.
And again, let me just real quickly before we run out of time talk about some of the speakers that you have, Rick, because these are individuals that have volunteered to come and speak in your event. Some of them could come and speak at another event, whether it's in New Hampshire, whether it's in Illinois, whether it's in Ohio, Michigan, California, wherever it might be. Talk about that.
Well, General Jerry Boykin, he for a number of years was the undersecretary in the Army, overseeing all of our intel. Before that, 20-plus years as a special ops officer, was original member of the Delta Force, but then led that entire operation for a number of years, including the famed Black Hawk Down incident. He'll be speaking, a tremendous man of God and a general. Dinesh D'Souza has been on our schedule since the beginning. We built this around him. Unfortunately, he called 2 days ago. His mother has died, and the funeral in India is on Tuesday. So we've had to release Dinesh, but he will be working with us in this project across Texas.
Sure.
Dinesh D'Souza is one of the great, courageous Christian warriors of our time. And if you don't know who he is, you listeners, you sure need to get familiar with this dynamic man who's paid a price to be a champion of our values.
Well, again, and he's been on the program with us. And again, you have a couple of local pastors, speakers, and others. And so I wanted, first of all, for anybody that could attend this, they can go to recoveramerica.now.org, and we'll have information about that on the website. That's taking place tomorrow. But I wanted to expand that and help our listeners in any state say, this is a model that you can use. We also have the I Vote values material that we're going to be making available and talking about in the next couple of weeks. There are all sorts of very excellent programs already there so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can take some of these ideas and begin to apply them. So, Rick Scarborough, I thank you for the work that you're doing there. Let's keep motivating pastors and members of the congregation to go out there and be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And wanted to launch this today, and I'm sure we'll have you over this program a number of times over the next couple of weeks. So thank you for joining us today.
God bless you, my friend, and bless your audience.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking to Abraham Hamilton. Some of you that listen on American Family Association's radio, AFR, will be familiar with the Hamilton Corner. For some of the rest of you, you may be meeting him for the first time, but he brings just an incredible amount of expertise in the government. And so I wanted to get his perspective on this whole idea of impeachment, the deep state, and how we as Christians can think this through. And, of course, we will continue to take your phone calls if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And then in the next hour, we'll also talk a little bit about discernment. Then I'll come back with a couple of other news stories. Some things we learned about this impeachment issue during the weekend. So we'll be talking about that in the next hour. But Alexander Hamilton, right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. As I mentioned, we now have Abraham Hamilton with us. For those of you that listen to American Family Radio, you are very familiar with him because he joins the roundtable sometimes on today's issues, hosts the Hamilton Corner, and also serves as American Family Association's General Counsel. And so I've always wanted to have him on. I'd love to get him on a regular basis if that would be possible, because he brings so much to the table. Has a law degree from Loyola University New Orleans College of Law, but has also served in the bureaucracy, served in the Justice Department, really kind of understands some of this, also has worked as a criminal prosecutor, really has had a ministerial focus on marriage, family, biblical worldview training, and discipleship. And if you have been listening to his Hamilton Corner, you know he's already addressed some of these issues of impeachment, of some of the problems of Joe Biden, and even, as we talked about last week, some of the issues of climate change. And those are just a few of the many topics he addresses on a regular basis. So, Abraham, it is great to have you on the program with us today here on Point of View.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you, Kerby. I've admired you from a distance for a long time, and so I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you now.
Mutual admiration. I really appreciate the work that you have done and your insight. And help us out. Let's, if we can, maybe just summarize some of the things from the Hamilton Corner, because you've been talking about this issue of impeachment. And I guess we need to kind of go through impeachment 101. I think right now there are enough Democrats, if indeed the New York Times estimate and Politico's estimate is right, there are enough Democrats that have said they would vote for impeachment, that if an articles of impeachment are brought to the House, they may actually vote to impeach the president. But then all that does is move the case over to the U.S. Senate. And first of all, what that does is it completely corrupts the U.S. Senate. It can't hardly do anything because it has to then turn this into a trial. It kind of corrupts and decapitates the U.S. Supreme Court, because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to actually convene that. So it's going to be a tremendous amount of interruption at a time when we really need to focus on some necessary issues. But what about this whole idea of impeachment? Do you think it is likely? And what would it do to the country if indeed the president is impeached?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if we can rewind ourselves back into history, you know, with the blowing and going in our society, we often have recency bias. But if you remember, soon after the president's victory in November of 2016, there were calls for impeachment already back then. Soon after it was inaugurated, Congressman from Houston, his name just left my mind, had filed articles of impeachment before anything had happened, before the Bob Mueller's investigation concluded, and all of those things. So there has been a consistent effort to overturn really the will of the American people and get President Trump out of office. And going forward, in terms of what it would do to the country, I think it's pretty plain to see that we are at such a polarized place that it would cause extreme division in the country. There, prior to the most recent conversations concerning the president's phone call to the Ukrainian president, the overwhelming majority of the American people opposed impeachment of the president. Then there was a poll that came out in the last couple days, which I'm not so sure I trust 100%, that is, especially when you look at some of the metrics for the poll and the people who conducted the poll,
right,
who were saying that a majority of Americans support impeachment proceedings. But that being said, I think there are a significant number of Americans, regardless of political persuasion, that see there's been a consistent effort to resist President Trump. And I think this is the latest iteration of that, and I think a lot of the American people see that plainly for what it is, and as a result would not look too kindly on impeachment proceedings.
And again, you recognize Representative Al Green was the one that filed that, and you go to Maxine Waters, you go through a short list, and I've seen that grow over time. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting timeline that Politico gives where there were people calling for impeachment of the president the day after he was elected. So some of that was the case, but then you reach kind of critical mass. But help us understand, even you've worked within the Justice Department, you worked within the government, so maybe you have a little better insight than the rest of us. The president is on the phone to President Zelensky. There's some people in the Situation Room taking some notes, maybe typing them, writing them, whatever, and then they pull together something that it's called a transcript. Now, it's not a word-for-word transcript, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the president says. But there are certainly some suggestions that some people knew about this so-called whistleblower a long time ago, even knew about what was going to be said. So is there a possibility that there's such a thing as a deep state that has been working behind the scenes to actually overturn the Trump presidency?
Now, that's the amazing thing you highlight, Kerby, because prior to August of 2019, we now have documented proof that in secret, the inner workings of the CIA changed the standard for what would be determined to be a legal whistleblower. Prior to August of 2019, in order to be considered a whistleblower within the ambit of protection of the whistleblower, the federal whistleblower statute, you had to be a person that had firsthand information as to whatever you were communicating as was detrimental to the American public. Well, unbeknownst to the American public, the CIA changed that standard that would allow for secondhand information to be reported. We call that in the legal community hearsay. Now, how can you make an allegation against someone that you are not aware of personally? You're just relaying what somebody else told you. Because of the inherent unreliability of secondhand information, that kind of information is not even admissible in a court of law. Well, going forward, if you look at the whistleblower complaint itself, it is dated August 12th, 2019. So the public conversations concerning the whistleblowers' allegations began at the end of September, but the allegations were held by Adam Schiff in particular, chairman of the House Committee on this matter. He's had it since August 12th. So it gives the indication that there was some behind-the-scenes workings together, and a few days after the whistleblower standards are changed within the CIA, we have then this August 12th revelation that shows, a surprise, surprise, secondhand information serves as the basis concerning the President Trump's conversation with the Ukrainian president. And now we have Nancy Pelosi, who previously, at least publicly, opposed anything approaching impeachment of President Trump. Now, magically, following those sequence of events, she is in favor of impeaching the president. It does give an indication for people that have been concerned about a deep state operation that our concerns are well-founded.
Well, again, it looked pretty coordinated. All the Democrats jumped on board. So that suggests that not only Adam Schiff had this, but he passed it around to a lot of the Democrats. All the media, at least the mainstream media, jumped on board. I mean, I've never seen such a coordinated effort. And so it illustrates at least that is taking place. So those are some things I wanted to get your perspective on, just as somebody that has worked in the government. But I also want to get your thoughts, and you've addressed this on the Hamilton Corner, in terms of the problems that are surfacing, because one of the things that the mainstream media is not covering, let's give credit where credit is due, I think you at American Family Radio have been covering it, and others have, is that we have an individual, Hunter Biden, who, by the way, does not have any kind of expertise in the area of energy. As a matter of fact, found himself in some pretty difficult situations when you really start thinking about some of his background. An individual that was tossed out of the Navy Reserve for using cocaine and all sorts of other things, now getting paid, some people say $50,000 a month. Some say is up to $65,000 a month. And so there is at least the appearance of some kind of conflict of interest. And then you have Joe Biden, who actually stepped in, and we don't have to guess about this because at the Council on Foreign Relations, he actually bragged about the fact that he was able to withhold $1 billion in military funding. So if nothing else, when people talk about a quid pro quo, it seems to me that the quid pro quo actually is one that fits more the Biden family than it does anything that was communicated between Donald Trump and the president of Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
You're absolutely right. And it's amazing that, again, this is not even speculation, because you have Vice President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, being appointed to the board of this Burisma Ukrainian energy company. And at the exact time that Burisma was being investigated by the Ukrainian equivalent of their attorney general, it's called the prosecutor general in Ukraine, Vice President Biden withheld the $1 billion in aid contingent upon that prosecutor being terminated from his position. Well, interestingly enough, that prosecutor Shokin, that's his last name, the prosecutor general, was investigating Burisma, which included the calling in for questioning of Hunter Biden. Now, we don't have to speculate as to whether or not the termination of the prosecutor general was based on Joe Biden's withholding the money, because speaking before the Council on Foreign Relations, he admitted it in the braggadocious fashion, basically saying you have 6 hours to fire this guy or you don't get this money. And it's amazing to me how disinterested the media is in that story, whereas if you just change the names of the people, the party affiliations of the people involved, let's say President Trump's son, Don Jr., was doing this thing, how interested would the media be in that? I find that to be remarkably interesting.
We'll talk a little bit more with Abraham Hamilton right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you have some comments about impeachment and about the investigation of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, would love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. Abraham Hamilton with us. And again, the Hamilton Corner is something that those of you that are listening to this program that actually already listen to it on American Family Radio may be familiar with. I know a good number, matter of fact, a very significant number of those of you listening to the program right now do not actually receive this program through American Family Radio. So I would really encourage you to check it out. We have a link to Hamilton Corner. You can just go to afr.net or simply just follow our link, and you will then see the various episodes that he has been involved with. And your point, Abraham, just a minute ago was a good one, because Elizabeth Vaughn in Red State put it this way: the mainstream media skate over the very real evidence that, at the very least, Hunter Biden's cushy job and appointment to the board of Burisma Holdings, while his father, the vice president of the United States at the time, served on the Obama administration's point man in Ukraine, represented a conflict of interest, and that Joe Biden threatened to withhold $1 billion in U.S. aid to the country unless they fired their prosecutor general. And so then she goes through and says, fact number one, everybody recognizes it's a conflict of interest. Fact number two, we recognize that Joe Biden actually said that he was the one that forced the firing of that official. So then if you try to come up with even what she calls the least bad scenario, the one that raises the fewest number of eyebrows, you still end up with fact number one, it's poor judgment, maybe not a violation of the law, but it's at least poor judgment. Fact number two probably was a violation of the law. And yet, back to the point you're making, the mainstream media just are very incurious about this. There just seems to be no interest in actually looking at what is supposed to be the justification for impeachment. I can't see any interview that's been done with Hunter Biden, and I haven't seen Joe Biden say much more other than his campaign now tells all the mainstream media that they're not supposed to do interviews anymore with Rudy Giuliani. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that is absolutely remarkable. The reason why our media enjoys First Amendment protection is because our founders understood that in order for the American populace to remain a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that we must be informed. But we see almost unanimous lack of curiosity on this front, which, again, and I don't want to sound, pie in the sky, black helicopters type of perspective, but it does make you wonder how deep the coordination goes, because to have an almost unanimous refusal to ask a question about this, combined with now Joe Biden demanding that mainstream media outlets refuse to interview Rudy Giuliani, this is absolutely remarkable. And again, it's even Stevie Wonder could see that if you had different people and different party affiliations, it would be a completely different story. If Donald Trump Jr. had done what Hunter Biden had done, there would be no limit to digging for these facts, subpoenas issued, asking of questions. But because it's Joe Biden, nobody's asking any questions about this, or at least not people in the mainstream media asking questions about this. And it's a sad day for our republic, I have to say. It's a sad day that we've gotten to the place where the political rancor has reached such a fever pitch where we're willing to traipse the fundamentals of our constitutional republic in order to resist President Trump.
Let's, if I can, go back to last Monday in the Hamilton Corner, in which you said, we told you this back in April. Now, you are a very bright individual and politically sophisticated, but let's talk about that for just a minute. What did you know, and how did you know this back in April, when today, as you said, some of the media still can't seem to follow the dots? What about that?
Well, back in April, I during my preparation for my program, I stumbled across video from Joe Biden speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yes.
And bragging about him requiring Prosecutor General Shokin to be fired in order for the $1 billion to be disseminated. And then I followed that with some of John Solomon's writing and Peter Schweitzer's media interviews, and I realized, wait a minute, the time period that Joe Biden is referring to is back in March of 2016. This is the exact same time period that the Ukrainian Prosecutor General was investigating Burisma Holdings. And I said, wait a minute, this is a huge scandal. This is a gigantic scandal. And so I presented all of that information, including Joe Biden's own verbiage, to the Hamilton Corner listening audience. And to be candid, I was expecting at least some media entities to take up some curiosity about this, but I was shocked that nobody covered this at all. And I thought to myself, now, wait a minute, the very thing that the Trump administration is often accused of doing, once again, the Democrat that preceded President Trump's administration was doing it. I mean, when you have the connection to the Ukraine, I said, shouldn't there be a bit more curiosity? And the other thing that I find interesting is that in the recent declassification of President Trump's phone call to the Ukrainian president, when he talked to the Ukrainian president about doing a favor, he was referring to CrowdStrike, the private company that conducted the forensic examination of the DNC servers. He wasn't talking about anything to do with Joe Biden at that point of the conversation. But the media is also conveniently disinterested in the actual context of that statement instead of running with the narrative that it seems they had prepared beforehand.
If some of this is coming fast and furious, let me just mention that on Friday we actually posted a piece by John Solomon, which I think you're going to find very helpful. Questions about Joe Biden's Ukraine story. And that is something that actually showed up, interestingly enough, in The Hill. And we also, on Friday, when we had Gary Bauer with us, also talked about the fact that, as you point out, the mainstream media, and Gary Bauer even said sometimes even Fox News got it wrong. They didn't recognize that the first point where the president said favor, he was talking about the investigation of the 2016 election and CrowdStrike. And then there are these ellipses. And those 3 dots represent a deletion of 560 words down to then the conversation about Biden. And I'm afraid that most people don't get that. You get it, and Gary Bauer got it, and I think a lot of people that have read the transcript get it. But the average person actually probably thinks that he even said get dirt on those people, and that comes from a parody by Adam Schiff, right?
That's absolutely right. I even played the audio of Adam Schiff, who began his House of Representatives committee hearing, reading his own manufactured idea of the phone call. And it was not until he was challenged on that manufacturing when he had admitted that, that was a parody. And when did we begin initiating House of Representatives hearings with the chairman of the various committees reciting parody? I mean, this is, pardon my French, but this is crazy town that we're in.
I know.
And
they're taking crazy pills, right?
Yeah, that's clearly what it is. And the unfortunate reality is that the American public is hanging in the balance, because what exactly happened is what Adam Schiff wanted to happen, that the narrative of his parody is what is being spouted about. I've heard people say numerous times, well, the president said it 7 or 8 times. Well, that's just factually inaccurate. It's factually inaccurate, but because that is what Schiff announced in his parody, that is what the media is running with, that is what a lot of the people in the American populace believe. Yes. And we have an entire polling, I would say, concerning the temperature of the American people on impeachment being taken based on a false representation of the information, unfortunately.
Well, we need to go to the break, and I need to let you get ready for your program. But first of all, we have a link to the Hamilton Corner. If you already are listening to our program on American Family Radio, you might want to listen to him a couple hours from now. But if not, we have the link to the various episodes there on everything from the impeachment inquiry, Joe Biden, the whistleblower scandal, and a variety of others, including the whole issue of climate change. So I would certainly encourage you to go and find that out, and you can see why we certainly do respect the opinion of Abraham Hamilton, and it's just been great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Oh, my pleasure. I got to have you on my program, Kerby.
We need to take a break, though. When we come back, one of the themes at Point of View is discernment. We're going to talk about that right after this.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about a topic that we come back to time and time again. That is the issue of discernment. And then we'll come back into some of the conversation we had the last hour in this last half hour, in which we'll get into a little bit more of the news, information, and perspective on impeachment, as well as a couple other items in the news that I think you need to know about. But one of the things that we do talk about so often is the need for discernment, especially in a time when we have everything from fake news to too much information. And so this book, I thought, would be a great conversation starter for us today. All That's Good, Recovering the Lost Art of Discernment. It's about 200 pages, and it is written by Hannah Anderson. I might say that you perhaps are familiar with her. She's certainly been providing commentary on what's happening in the women's ministry. Maybe you've seen her book that came out a number of years ago, Made for More, or more recently her book, Humble Roots. This one, All That's Good, is certainly one that I want to commend to you. And there's a first section that we'll talk about that gets into some of this topic. Then the middle part is really kind of based on Philippians 4:8, those things which are true and honorable and just and pure and lovely and commendable. And then kind of a final conclusion, as well as some great material for a discussion. So if you wanted to have a good discussion about developing biblical discernment, this might be a book that you might want to consider if you're a small group leader or Bible fellowship leader. She and her husband live in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. Matter of fact, her husband actually is involved in a rural ministry there as well. She's also the co-host of Christ and Pop Culture podcast and Persuasion, and joins me now by phone. So, Hannah, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me, Kerby. I'm delighted to be with you.
Let's get into this issue of discernment. It does seem to me that we need discernment more than ever. When Marlon Maddox started this show back in 1972, he was trying to provide a biblical perspective because you weren't hearing it at all in the media, and that is still one of the goals and missions here. But over time, because we have certainly a lot of Christian programs, we have lots of internet, we have lots of cable, now I feel like the most important thing we can do is not only provide a Christian perspective, but help people sort out between that which is true and which is not so true, or maybe even is false. And that is why I find myself spending more and more time talking about this issue of discernment. And I would suggest that it's always been important for Christians to develop their skills in discernment, but I think even more so in the 21st century. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely agree with you. And I love how you reference even the difference between just 30 or 40 years ago. You're absolutely right that the scripture has always called Christians to discernment. It is part of our Christian walk, Christian maturity. But we live in a world today that is so radically different just by how much information we can access. The digital age has completely transformed how we're accessing stories, news, how we understand what's happening around us, even who we listen to as our theologians and our preachers and our teachers. It used to be that a person would go to their church or they would listen to their local radio station, Christian radio station, and that's how they knew how to understand the scripture. And even now, we can get online, and if we want 6 different understandings of a particular passage, we can get 6 or 600. So we live in a time where we're just flooded with opinions and information, and it can be really hard to sort through all of that.
One of the things I appreciate about your book is you make a distinction, and I think it's an important one, between information and knowledge. I'd also say between information and wisdom, because we have at our fingertips with our smartphones, our computers, basically all the digitized information in the world. So we can think we're really smart when we have access to all the facts, but if we don't understand how those connect together and we don't understand which ones we should believe and which ones we should reject, we're not in a very good situation. So we're awash in those facts and information, but that isn't knowledge, and it certainly isn't wisdom, is it?
No, it isn't. And I think the scripture also speaks to wisdom being something that happens and is given to us in our relationship with God through the Holy Spirit's leadership as well. And when we're just Googling things, we may have the ability to find out lots of data, or like you said, have lots of information and get all of the facts that we think we need. But that's not the same thing as knowing what to do with it or knowing how to apply it in a very specific context, maybe an interpersonal relationship or a specific question in your family or in your church. And so we get tricked into thinking that we're a lot smarter or a lot wiser than we actually are, because we live in a time where we can just look up all kinds of information. But that doesn't mean that we actually know what to do with it.
Let's, if we can, just give people a sense of how your book is put together, because obviously we won't cover all of it in a half an hour, but the first section is really based on Philippians 4:7. You know, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And you talk about the idea of the good earth and being worldly wise. Then the second section, of course, Philippians 4:8, whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable. You take that part of Philippians 4:8, and that is kind of the center part of the book, and those are just such good tests to use. And then finally, the third section picks up the last part of verse 8 into verse 9. If there's any moral excellence, if there's anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. Do what you have learned and received and heard from me and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. So in some respects, if somebody really wanted to do a Bible study on Philippians 4 through 9, that's what the book's all about in some respects, isn't it?
It is. And when I was studying and I came to that passage in Philippians, I was struck by how relevant that context was, because even in that first part of chapter 4 in Philippians, Paul is trying to calm the Philippian believers who are living in the midst of chaos around them, and they're feeling the anxiety and the weight. And the way he even speaks to them, he speaks to the confusion that they feel in their minds. And I remember reading that thinking, well, that's exactly the world we're living in. That's what it feels like when I get online, is I feel anxious, I feel chaos, I feel like I don't know what to think. And Paul is offering to them the hope that as they turn to Christ, as they bring their concerns to him, that he's going to guard their hearts and minds. But then he moves almost seamlessly into this discussion of seeking those things that are true and honorable and just and pure and lovely, almost as if to say, here's how that's going to work out. You know, Christ is going to guard your minds in the midst of this very chaotic, confusing time. You turn your minds toward those things that are representing the nature of Christ in the world, things that are true, things that are honorable, things that are just. And then he concludes by saying, now let's practice this. It's not just going to be theoretical. Let's move into actually living this way and practicing the things that we have seen and learned.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Hannah Anderson. We have a link to sometimesalight.com, which will give you more information about this book and about her, and we'll apply a few of those tests that actually appear in Philippians 4:8. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, one of the largest youth-led demonstrations took place around the globe. Those young people in New York then convened a Youth Climate Summit on the weekend preceding the Climate Week that followed at the United Nations. If you were paying attention, you likely heard what sounded like two different messages, but actually each one was tailored for the appropriate audience. We used to hear that we only have a few years or a decade before doom and gloom. Now we're hearing many environmentalists talking about what will happen in 50 years or 100 years. The problem with doom and gloom predictions is they can be tested. A few months ago, I wrote a commentary that listed many of the failed predictions by Paul Ehrlich, George Wald, and others. The problem with making a prediction that millions will starve to death by 1980 is you discover that millions didn't starve to death. The Competitive Enterprise Institute recently posted dozens and dozens of failed environmental predictions that never occurred. That's why you're hearing leaders now talking about what will happen 50 to 100 years from now. You can't disprove that. Why are we simultaneously hearing young people in the streets and even in Congress claiming that we only have 10 to 12 years left? That is simple. They don't have any history of failed environmental predictions, and it's worth adding that they don't really know much about history. They are less likely to be skeptical as the adults. Some of us remember when we were told that the greatest threat was global cooling because we were putting particulates in the atmosphere. Then we heard that the threat was global warming because we were putting CO2 in the atmosphere. The current threat has morphed into climate change, or now climate crisis. The policy recommendations for each are the same, even though the strategy and the timeline have changed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Hannah Anderson for a few more minutes as we talk about this book, All That's Good, Recovering the Lost Art of Discernment. And again, you learn a lot more than just discernment. As a matter of fact, Hannah, you spent a fair number of times talking about pies, made me hungry every time I'd read some of the sections of your book. But nothing else. I've certainly appreciated learning a little bit more about you and your husband and the ministry that you have there in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But let's get into this issue of discernment for just a minute. And first of all, just kind of basic discernment, even before you get biblical discernment, is what I call common sense. I mean, even if you're not a Christian, you can say, well, first of all, if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. If somebody lied to you in the past, you probably want to be skeptical about what they tell you the next time. I mean, that's just sort of basic common sense. But certainly in Philippians 4, verse 8, we have 6 very good tests. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable. You have a very significant section in which you take on some of those very important issues. And so let's talk about truth. We live in a society today that's been called the post-truth culture, the post-modern culture. I think it's important more than ever for Christians to really begin to understand that truth is found in God's Word. And if we're not using God's Word to determine what is true, we're going to be very easily seduced into some of the ideas of the world.
Absolutely. And I think we also have to recognize that truth sometimes comes with this negative feel to it, right? I think sometimes we can shy away from what we know is truth because we're afraid it's divisive, or we're afraid that somehow saying this is not true will create conflict. And what I realized in my study, and as I let the Scripture itself unfold what is true, is that really the lack of shared truth, the lack of shared understanding that there's objective truth is what's leading to the conflict we see. So we sometimes hear people maybe suggesting, well, let's all just be tolerant of each other. Let's just let you have your truth and I'll have my truth and we'll find a way to coexist. When in reality, it's the difference of saying you have your truth and I have my truth that actually leads to conflict because we can't agree on anything anymore. And so it's fascinating as Scripture reveals truth that part of the reason we move towards truth as it is revealed in Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and the life is for the purpose of unity. It's so that we can all be reconciled to the things that are ultimate reality in the world, that God is God and that we are creatures made in his image and we submit to him, and that all the things that are up for grabs, it feels like now, really aren't. That he has the right as our creator to establish truth. And as we align ourselves with what he has said is true, we actually will have greater unity as families, as churches, as communities.
Well said. You know, again, also this idea of if you rely on your feelings, we've talked about this with the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and those kinds of things, that if you just trust your feelings, then you're really going to have trouble kind of discerning truth. But let me move on to another one. Whatever is honorable. When we talk about honor, that it almost sounds like a word that comes from the 19th century, unless you're in the military. We still, of course, really talk about honor in the military and certainly at the military academy. But this idea of honor and respect and things of that nature are something that we need to recapture. And it's, I think, telling that right after Paul talks about truth, he talks about honor.
It is, because essentially the idea of honor is to give weight to the things that deserve weight, to give glory to the things that deserve to be glorified, to respect the things that are respectable. And I think it's fascinating in our postmodern culture that honor has been replaced with a false form of celebrity. And so we see people giving glory or giving weight or giving attention to things that really don't deserve honor. Mm-hmm. And yet we are so caught up in fame and power and wealth that the celebrity of an actor or a songwriter or someone who is in sports, their just fame replaces true honor, and we'll follow after that. And I think one of the ways that we can be deceived is letting something like celebrity tell us this is worth following rather than knowing, is this truly honorable? Is this truly worth my attention? Is it worth the glory I'm giving it?
And certainly that is the case. One other one I thought I'd just pick out real quickly, and that is the idea of whatever is pure. In a sexually debauched culture, in a culture where we see so much sex violence, we hear profanity and those kinds of things, this is perhaps one of the most important and significant tests. It was certainly a test that the Apostle Paul needed to apply in the Hellenistic Greek world and the Roman world, but we need to apply that same test today, don't we?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I have come to realize is as we see these expressions of just godless sexuality and this impurity that has taken over our culture, if we can pause long enough to understand that those impure actions are actually reflecting a deeper fragmentation in our hearts, I think it helps us understand where the real problem lies. Like we rightly can object to changing sexual mores. We can object to agendas that are being pushed, but the deeper problem, and the problem that Scripture gets to when it talks about purity, is that our hearts are not whole. Our hearts are fragmented. We are not loving God purely, first and foremost, and then that's overflowing into our actions. And one of the things that was so striking to me in my study of how the scripture speaks about purity is that it's talking about pure water or pure gold or something is 100% devoted to God, to love God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so when we see impure things happening, whether it's in our physical lives, whether it's in sexuality or it's in our language, what that's revealing, that's a symptom of a heart that is not fully and wholly and purely devoted to our Creator.
Let me just mention that we do have a link to your Twitter feed, to your Facebook post, as well as to your blog. But just for a minute, let's talk about what's near the end of the book, and that is almost 20 pages of the various chapters, 11 different chapters, where you have a section where you can review some of the material that you've covered, a place to reflect, some things to read, some key verses, and then some things to remember. So the way you've put this together, Hannah, is something that I would think any listener that maybe wanted to develop a course, maybe a Bible study, a small group study on discernment could take this book, and it is made perfectly for someone to go through either an 11-week study, or you could maybe double up on a few chapters and do that in maybe half the time. But this would just be a great opportunity to teach the lost art of discernment. But talk about what's available at the back of the book and how people can use it.
One of the things that I hope for with this book is that it would not just stay as a mental exercise, that it would actually become practical. The funny thing about discernment is it is something you learn by doing as much as by study. So we could lock ourselves up in rooms and we could just talk about it, but the actual practice of it and the actual doing is what we're called to. And so my hope was, by including these study guides and these questions in the back, is that people would gather in community, that they would gather with other Christians, they would gather in their churches, they would gather in their Sunday schools, and they would begin to take these ideas and move them beyond the page to actual application and practice in their lives. So yes, it would thrill my heart if people used this book in community and study with each other, and that they would grow as Christians together in their discernment.
I might just mention her other books, which I mentioned at the outset: Humble Roots, How Humility Grounds and Nourishes Your Soul, kind of a theology of incarnation, as well as a stroll through the fields and forest, as well as Made for More, an invitation to live in God's image, and to really just begin to think about who you are and how you get your identity. And of course, this book, All That's Good, Recovering the Lost Art of Discernment. They're all published by our good friends at Moody. And Hannah, I appreciate you writing these books. I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. Last half hour, we will focus on the subject of impeachment and a few more things we've learned over the weekend in terms of what might unfold over the next couple of weeks, and also a couple of other recommendations that we have for you. So we got a lot more to cover, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to get into a couple of issues related to impeachment, but a couple of other topics I wanted to address, especially some of the things being said right now by some of the leading Democrat candidates. So we'll see if we can cover most of that today. If not, we'll get to that tomorrow. Let's head out to Ohio first. Diane, I think you have a question, and I appreciate you calling today.
Okay, thank you. I wondered, why do those who identify as conservatives choose to endorse the globalist elite agenda that has the people of Hong Kong demonstrating in the streets right now as at risk of life and limb? And I'd like to know what causes them to believe that the elitist tent is so large as to embrace them once this subversion of our government is complete. History places progressive media activists and of every overthrown government literally on the firing line first, along with professionals and the intelligentsia.
I think you've very well stated that. First of all, that was, I think, insightful to say, look at what's happening in Hong Kong and then look what's happening in the United States. You know, look, I've done this on a couple of occasions saying, look, they're flying the American flag, and over here sometimes people can't even stop or long enough to salute the American flag, or they'll turn their back on it or get on their knees during the NFL games or whatever. But you point out another one, and that is what makes some conservatives, I want to be fair, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but some with the elites, and I think part of that has to do with money. Marlon Maddox, who started this program back in 1972, used to use the phrase all the time. Of course, he's not the only one to ever use it, but it was true. Follow the money. And there are a fair number of individuals that go with maybe small government, pro-life, pro-family inclinations to Washington, D.C., and then when they get there, they get supported by some of the lobbyists, what I oftentimes refer to as the K Street lobbyists, because a lot of those lobby groups are right there on K Street in Washington, D.C. And so as a result, they're the ones that fund those programs and those projects and things of that nature. And so they kind of get seduced by it. But it does seem to me that globalist ideas are certainly antithetical to the true conservative viewpoint. And yet I think you've pointed out what I think is a very good summary of what has sometimes co-opted some of the people in the conservative movement. So I really do agree with you on that.
Thank you. I just would encourage people to read a few books of people who have experienced the Soviet Gulag and find that they are imprisoned with all the other doctors and all the other intelligentsia and all the other that you changed your clothing to avoid being picked up in the first place. But these people are all online on the media, and they will be first on the firing line, and I mean a real firing line.
Sure. And your point's well taken, because, you know, whether you look at Cambodia, Pol Pot, or even in some cases, they would look at your hands, and if you had calluses, they'd say, well, you're part of the working class. But if you look like you were a professional, you were the first one to go to the gulag or the first one to be executed. So points well taken. And of course, again, I just mentioned Marlon Maddox in passing, but one of the things that I've always appreciated is his willingness to go after and to talk about things like globalism. We just recently even talked about whether or not some of the attempts to put together some kind of treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, whether that's really wise. And I think the reason you don't hear a lot of that is because some of these major corporations are the advertisers for some of those different companies and different news outlets. And just think this through for just a minute. How much are you going to talk about globalism when a global company advertises on your network? How much are you going to talk about maybe some of the problems with big pharma if pharmaceutical companies are advertising on your network? And you can kind of see why we oftentimes say around here, no topic is off the table, because we are beholden just to you as the listeners. And so It allows us to cover a lot of stories that never get covered, even sometimes in other, quote, conservative talk shows, but certainly not in the mainstream media. I'm going to keep moving because I have some other phone calls. And Diane, call back again because I'd like to get into that. And maybe next time we cover this idea of globalism, I'd love to have you come back on and give us some more comments. But let's give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation before I get into this issue of impeachment. So we'll go to South Carolina this time, WLPG. And Brian, you wanted to remind us about Rosh Hashanah. So go ahead.
Kirby, thank you for taking my call. Today is the Jewish Civil New Year, the Feast of Trumpets. This feast is really more significant to Christians than it is to the Jewish people because the Feast of Trumpets coincides with the day when Jesus was born. If you will look back at the Feast of the Passover in 6 BC, which was on May the 2nd, if you look on your star charts, that's when it was, and go from there 8 weeks to the end of the Saturday, 8 weeks later, for the end of the priest of Abijah, that division of which Zacharias was, and then he came home the end of that week, and 9 months from there, or more, somewhere more, would be the birth of John the Baptist. And another 5 months from there would be the birth of Jesus, which would put it in the month of September of 5 BC, before the death of Herod in 4 BC. So God has typically used feast days to announce to his people the coming of important events. And the nearest feast day into the month of September is the Feast of Trumpets, which is fitting enough because trumpets announce the arrival of the King. Sure. And the Feast of Trump, hello?
Yeah, I heard that. And again, the other one I would add is that some people have even thought the Feast of Trumpets may someday be associated with the rapture. So you've got some good points there. And again, if nothing else, Rosh Hashanah. And I wanted to mention just a little bit of that celebration as well. And Brian, appreciate you giving us that update real quickly. Before we take a break, let me just take a couple of issues that we did briefly talk about with Abraham Hamilton, and I wanted to put those on the table before we take a break. And the first of those is I am noticing more and more of these commentators making this statement that Derek Hunter does in his column today. If the case for Trump's impeachment is so strong, why are liberals lying about it, he says. And, of course, his argument is that I think we all learned that even as kids, honesty is the best policy. Because when you have a situation, if you tell the truth, then you just tell the truth. It's real easy. If you don't tell the truth, then you have to remember, okay, who did I lie to? What did I say? Now I've got to make sure my next lie covers the other lie. It just gets complicated. And the point he's making is that we now have the transcript. Okay, I know it's not a word-for-word transcript, but everybody's calling it a transcript, so I'm going to call it that, or the memorandum. And we know pretty much what the president said. And now, even now that we have the transcript, he reminds us of all the individuals that just keep saying what was originally alleged to be said according to the so-called whistleblower. He gives us an example out of MSNBC where they summarized the transcript by saying, will you do me a favor and investigate Joe Biden's son? Do me a favor and get involved in the 2020 election. That's not what the transcript says. Or another one out of CNN where it says dig up dirt on Biden. No, that was what, Adam Schiff said as his parody. And so now we're having people quoting the parody that Adam Schiff made in the House of Representatives as the Intelligence Committee instead of the actual transcript. So even when we have the transcript, people are still using their particular assessment that they came to early on as the way in which they communicated. And that is the real frustration, because as Derek Hunter points out, if there is a story about Ukraine, it goes all the way back to January of 2017, after Donald Trump was elected. Politico, which is kind of a left-of-center organ, actually had the headlines, Ukrainian efforts to sabotage Trump backfire. And in the article, it points out that there were people working with Hillary Clinton, the Clinton campaign, and others
to try to research damaging information on Donald Trump and his advisors. And so, as we've pointed out here, there is just an inability to get the story right, and there is an incredible amount of lying or misrepresenting. I don't know how much of it's intentional and how much of it is sheer incompetence, but the reality is we're just not even getting close to the true story. So when we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And one particular writer refers to that as gaslighting, the phenomenon in which you keep insisting on the false version of events so that people that are listening begin to doubt their own version of the events. We'll come back and talk about what that means right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable, but I'll be joining for one of those hours because we have Ruth Graham in studio. So you'll be able to hear Nick Pitts for one of the hours, but I'll be taking the other one in which we'll spend some time talking with Ruth Graham. Might also mention that Ann Graham Lotz will be with us by phone in just a couple of weeks. So we really are going to cover almost all the Graham family before we're all through here. So I just thought I would give you that as a program note. All through the week, we're going to be covering lots of important stories. And one of those has to do with this piece by Elizabeth Vaughn, gaslighting. I've never liked the term, but it comes from a movie
I wish some wordsmith would come up with a better idea, but what it is gaslighting is a phenomenon that we sometimes talk about in psychology or with these dysfunctional families, where you have somebody keeps insisting on the false version of facts that after a while you start thinking, well, maybe they're right and I'm wrong. There's a closely related phenomenon which came out in a book years ago called crazy making, where sometimes a person who's crazy, after a while, they can make you think you're the one that's crazy and they're the one that's sane. Well, this is the same kind of idea. And the point I'm making is that Democrats, according to Elizabeth Vaughn, and I would say the leader of this has been sometimes Nancy Pelosi, but also Adam Schiff, who I mentioned just a minute ago, who are just at the very least making some statements that aren't true. And I think you've already heard those. And I mentioned when I was talking with Abraham Hamilton, the lack of interest on the part of the mainstream media when it comes to Hunter Biden and his father, Joe Biden, who is the vice president, because we have at least a couple of facts that nobody dismisses. So the only way the press can cover it is by either ignoring it or misrepresenting it. And the first fact is obviously Hunter Biden's dealing, at the very least, would be a conflict of interest. And so if you want to even take what she calls the least bad scenario, the one that's least objectionable, you'd have to at least say that was poor judgment, even if you don't accept that it might have been a violation of law. And it certainly makes very little sense for somebody with no experience in the energy sector to be paid $50,000, sometimes people say as high as $65,000 a month for doing very little. And then the second one is, of course, it's not open for any kind of debate that Joe Biden actually forced the firing of a Ukrainian official. So at this point, you've got to say the least bad or the least objectionable scenario is he was just concerned about corruption. But the fact that he was in the midst of investigating Joe Biden's son does make it difficult. And back to the key point, that is the press is focused enormous amount of attention right now on a phone call on July 25th and misrepresented, by the way, what actually was said on the phone call, because as I point out, you have these three dots, these ellipses, that leave out 560 words and make it sound like the favor that the president was asking for had to do with the 2020 election and Joe Biden, when the favor had to do with the 2016 ongoing investigation by the Attorney General. And more importantly, I love Elizabeth Vaughn. Don't know if she's a Christian or not, but she says it all reminds her of Matthew 7. And that's the well-known verse where Jesus talks about, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye but fail to notice the beam in your own? And so there's just an incredible amount of focus right now on something that isn't really the key story, but you would think it was the way the press has been covering it. So then we have another one, and that is Joe Biden's campaign right now is trying to shut down Rudy Giuliani. Maybe this has happened before, but here I have it, the presidential letterhead, Biden for President, in which they're expressing their desire to have all the mainstream media keep former mayor and the president's personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, off the air. And that could be simply because they know Giuliani is hurting Trump, maybe. But more importantly, I think, is because they recognize that it's just reminding everybody about Joe Biden, and more importantly, reminding people that this impeachment idea is not popular anyway. And unfortunately, they're just reminding people about the fact that this is being done for a reason that makes no sense at all. And so maybe that's the case, but I just cannot remember a presidential campaign saying you can no longer interview people on the other side of this campaign. I mean, really? I mean, where did that come from? So those are just a couple of stories that we've been following here and ones that we might cover in the future. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that we now see that the leading candidate may no longer be Joe Biden, but it's Elizabeth Warren. And on Friday, Dr. Merrill Matthews mentioned that his article was published in The Hill, and he actually has 4 points as to why Elizabeth Warren is taking the lead. Number one, Elizabeth Warren has been one of the best prepared and most engaged and on-message candidates of the bunch. talks about some of the ways in which every time somebody has a question, she says, I have a plan for that. So there's never a sense like you get from Beto O'Rourke of kind of like, well, I'm going to be thinking about that. I'm still kind of working on that. I got a plan for that. Got a plan for that. Got a plan for that. So she looks prepared. So that's number one. Number two, he says she seems approachable. A lot of candidates can often seem aloof when they're off camera. This is a woman that stands there for hours and lets people take selfies of her and other individuals. She talks to virtually everybody in the room. So she seems much more approachable. Number three, she has socialist policies without the socialist identification. If you like Bernie Sanders and you feel the burn, but you recognize that a person who, number one, is not a Democrat, number two, is an avowed socialist, that might harm you. If you like Bernie, get Elizabeth and you get the person who's a socialist without the socialist label. And then he says, finally, Warren can identify as a historically excluded minority. Well, not a Native American Indian, but, she is a woman, and that's a minority, which brings me to my final point, and that is Kyle Smith's been having some fun at the expense of Elizabeth Warren, pointing out something that is worth maybe raising as a question to some of the primary voters in the Democrat Party. Now, if you're a Democrat, you need to think about this for just a minute, because, first of all, you've got the fact that this is a woman, if indeed she is nominated by the Democratic Party. There are going to be just a few times where she's going to be called Pocahontas, or Liawatha. I've seen all of those now surfacing because of her phony insistence on being a Cherokee. You got a couple more. For example, her claim that her white parents had to elope because of racism. Or 5 years after the matter was litigated, she falsely asserted that Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. Or, this one I had not heard before. Kyle Smith said she stated she was the first nursing mother to take the bar exam in the state of New Jersey. And I love that. He says, as though people ever kept tabs on such strange details. Excuse me, ma'am, are you lactating at the moment? I'm making a record book. And on and on and on. The number of statements that she has made that are not true. And those certainly will surface in a campaign. So as the Democrat primary voters are considering who they would actually elect, they're still looking at Bernie Sanders. They're still looking at Elizabeth Warren. They're still looking a little bit at Kamala Harris. And, of course, they're still trying to figure out what the future is for Joe Biden. But I thought it was kind of interesting that I think Dr. Merrill Matthews did a good job of at least helping us understand why she is doing better and better in every poll. And so we will see whether or not Elizabeth Warren becomes the nominee. And that, of course, is something we'll be watching for quite some time. If you find yourself wanting to get some more information about any of the topics we've addressed today, we've had a number of different guests on the program. Go to the website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll click on that button that says Join the Team. We'd love to have you join the Truth Team. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.